Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to another in a video series for the Clifton Park Library. Today's topic is pretty timely because we've had some big news in the genealogy world in the month of April 2022. And that big news, in case you haven't figured it out yet, is that the 1950 United States Census has been released. It was released as of Friday, April 1st. So hopefully some of you who are tuning in today have had a chance to get in and take a look at the census before we go over it. And if you haven't, well, then definitely dive in and have a look around. I'm going to skim the surface of information and some few pointers about searching the census. This is by no means an exhaustive presentation. We could be here for hours if we wanted to do that. There is plenty of information online about the census and all aspects of it. So if you want more, I would suggest that you go to YouTube and look up 1950 United States Census videos, or use some of the resources on the websites that we're going to be talking about, because there's plenty of information out there. So these are the topics we're going to be covering. We're going to talk a little bit about the census release history. And we're going to talk about why do we even care about such a thing, how we can access the 1950 census, what we can expect to find on it as far as information goes, and also a little bit about searching suggestions, because at the moment searching is a little strange. It's not like how we're used to searching census records, and that's simply because it's brand new. So there has not been an opportunity yet for there to be extensive indexing done. So the search is going to be a little strange for a while. Okay, so years that end in 2 are very important in the hierarchy of census access. As we know, a lot of us as genealogists, we've been working with census records for a long time, so we know a little bit about the census anyway. Federal census, which is a population count, has been taken in the United States every 10 years since 1790. So starting in 1790, every 10 years, census takers would go out and mostly go door to door collecting information. And that happened pretty much up until the modern era. And even back in 2020, when the census was taken, there was still a bit of door to door going on. So it was mostly a door to door, face-to-face collection of information. There is a 72-year privacy law in place when it comes to census records. So in other words, if a census has been taken in, say, 1950, it needs to be 72 years old before it is released to the general public. And the reason behind that is 72 years was a calculated life expectancy when these laws were put in place in the 1950s. So that was a life expectancy of about 72 years. And the reason, of course, was privacy, because even in the 1950s, there were privacy concerns, as we have a lot more of those today. So any census that you're going to be looking at online that has names of individuals in it is going to be at least 72 years old. And these records, these census records, are among the most commonly used by family historians. So if you are just starting out your family history journey and you're not that familiar with census records, the more you get into it, the more you're going to become familiar with census records. They are just a backbone and basic record that people use to help them with their family history, and they can be incredibly useful for a variety of reasons. So some trivia and some facts about the census release. And the reason I started with 1920 was because I figured that was a fairly even date, and that was back as far as most of us can remember. The 1920 census was released on March 2nd, 1992. And the reason it was released in March of that year was because the census date in 1920 was in January. It was January 1st. So that census was available a little bit earlier than April 1st that year. And when it was first released, it was made available on microfilm at National Archives branches. So the only way you would have been able to view the census in 1992 was to go to one of the National Archives branches, and they are all over the country. The closest one to here in 1992 was in Pittsfield, Massachusetts, but that has since closed. And now the closest ones are either in New York City or in Waltham, Massachusetts. One of the things they did in 1992 was they took reservations for people to come into their reading room to be able to access the census. So these reservations were being taken months in advance. So this was a pretty big deal event in 1992. So 10 years later, in 2002, the 1930 census was released. Now, this is the first one that I remember personally from doing genealogy research, was 2002. And that was the first time that a special census website was created by NARA, which is National Archives and Records Administration. And that census was indexed through the efforts of volunteers from Ancestry and Family Search. And that continues to this day. That volunteer effort continues to this day. And that is what is helping to research to index the 1950 census. On April 1st, 2012, the 1940 census was released. This was the first census to be released as digital images. So the others were not originally digital images. They were imaged after being released, but the 1940 was the first to be released as a digital image. It was indexed by 163,000 individuals in 4 months. So that's kind of the benchmark that we're looking at as far as how long it will take to index the 1950 census. We're looking at the phenomenal rate of indexing that occurred in 2012 for the 1940 census. So we're hoping that that can be beat with the 1950 census and the volunteer efforts that are underway. So why do we care about the census? Why is this so important, and why is this such a big deal for genealogists? Well, the census can answer a few of the basic questions that we have when we start doing our family history, and some of those might be where, who, and when. As far as the where, they can tell us where our family lived. They can show us their community. You can get an idea of how big that community was simply by looking at how many pages the census was for that particular community. So if your family came from a community that you don't really know much about, you might not be living near there now, then the 1950 census might be able to give you some idea of the size of the population there. Who, of course, it answers the who question by listing the members of a particular household. So census records will give you the household makeup. It will show you the head of the household. It will show you any spouses or children or any other people that are living in that particular household. And it will give you the relationship of that person to the head of the household. So it gives a good solid base to put together family structures, which is something that we need to do when we're working on our family history. We need to know about our aunts, uncles, cousins, all of our siblings, and going back further on. Family structure helps us to figure out who is related to whom. It also gives you an idea of who in terms of community. So not only are you looking at your own family, but you might be looking at their neighbors up and down. My mother was looking at the picture of the census page that she was in for 1950, and she told me that she recognized quite a few of the names of the people on the page. In 1950, she was a teenager, so she recognized a lot of the people that were her neighbors. So that will give you an idea of community, where your people lived. And then also the when. Some of the when census on questions on the census include things about asking about military service, or about what the person did for a job, or how much money that person earned, and where did that person live 5 years previously. So all of those can give us some sort of a feel as to the situation our family was in 1950. Were they living in an area that was affluent? Were they living in an area that was not so affluent? What types of jobs and industries were they working in? So that gives us a little bit of an overview about the specific times that they were living in. So, of course, one of the things that we really want to know is we want to know, how do we access this 1950 census? Now, if we're used to accessing census records on different websites like Ancestry or Family Search or whatever we use to access our census records, if we go to those places where we're used to seeing them, we are going to see some utilities for the 1950 census, but it's not going to look the way the other census records do. And that's because it has not yet been indexed. Those other sites, in most cases, are going to give you an opportunity to search the 1950 census, but you're going to have to do it by place because there is no name index as of yet. But if we look on the 1950 census.archives.gov site, this is the actual NARA website that has been set up for access to the United States Census for 1950. On this site, we can search by name, but there are efforts underway to make this index better because there are quite a few problems with it at the moment. And those efforts are coming from the commercial websites as well as this website. I will put this link in the chat at the end of the program so that you will be able to get to it. So when you go to the website, this is what it looks like. You have a couple of options here. You can dive right in and begin the search, which I think is what most people would do, and I know that's what I did. Or you can go into the resources page. And the resources page is going to give you a little bit more background about the census, is going to give you some information about what questions were asked. It's going to give you some information about using the enumeration district maps or how to most effectively find your family in the census. So that's going to be more of a how-to page, the resources. So when we're thinking about searching, some things to be aware of when we want to start searching is that this is the first time with the release of a census that an index has been generated using OCR, or optical character recognition. So a computer has basically gone through the census and has created an index of sorts using OCR. Well, OCR is great. OCR is wonderful, but one of the problems with OCR is we're talking about handwritten records. So these records are not typed, they were handwritten by the census takers. So OCR is only going to be as good as the characters that it can recognize. And yes, it's wonderful technology, and it does make these records much more accessible than other census records have been when they were released. But there is definitely going to be needed some human intervention in order to make this index be much more comprehensive and usable for most people. We know the limitations of the technology. The limitations are it's wonderful, but we definitely need human intervention. If you want to search, it's going to be very helpful for you to know the residence area of your ancestor. So if you are looking for John Smith in New York City, it's probably going to be fairly difficult. If you're looking for John Smith in Guilderland, that might be a little easier, simply because you may have to resort to going through page by page to be able to find your ancestor. And of course, this is going to be much easier in a smaller community. The OCR search may lead you to a couple of pages. You may be able to get into those pages, but they may not be the right ones because we don't have a lot of search options at the moment. There are lots of tools and finding aids that are available to help you find ED numbers. So when I talk about ED, I'm talking about enumeration district. Every town and city was given an ED number. So as you can imagine, in a place like New York City or even Albany, you're going to have multiple ED numbers, and they're divided up in cities by blocks. In small towns, if the town is small enough, you may have one ED. If the town has a fairly insulated kind of downtown area, that might be one ED, whereas the outskirts of the town might be another ED. So just think in terms of breaking municipalities down into smaller components. That's what EDs are for. Fortunately, there are a few good tools to help us with figuring out what an ED might look like or what it might be for our place of where we want to look. And we'll look at that in a few minutes. So you can find under the resources tab, you can find ED maps. Now, ED maps are going to be very useful because they're going to show you an area where an ED covers. So if you are looking in a particular neighborhood, for example, you might know the address. You can look on the ED map to see if a particular ED would contain the address you're interested in. And that's going to be under the resources tab on the census website. you are going to be able to find those maps. And I find them fascinating because it shows the exact boundaries of the EDs. So they're really interesting to look at. An alternate tool, which I also find equally useful, is the ED Finder that was developed by Steve Morse and Joel Weintraub. And again, I will put the link to this in the chat at the end of this, because I use the Steve Morse ED Finder tool quite often, even with earlier census records. If I have a particular person that I can't find from the name search, then I will search using an address and find the ED in the Steve Morse ED Finder. And we'll look at that a little bit later on too. So of course, there are other websites that have the 1950 census. It's not just the NARA site, there are others. And the big three would be the commercial websites, Ancestry, Family Search, and MyHeritage. Now, two of these, Ancestry and MyHeritage, require subscriptions for use. And Family Search is, of course, free. MyHeritage is offering the 1950 census for free on its website. So you do not have to be a member of MyHeritage to search the 1950 census on MyHeritage. So with Ancestry, the current status of Ancestry's 1950 census hosting is that you can search it by location. You have to go in and choose your state, and then your county, and then your city or town. You can also search by the ED maps. And again, you can put in the town of interest like Guilderland, New York, and bring up an ED map that will show you the ED boundaries. And in the larger cities, we would use a city directory to find an address and then use the Steve Morse address search, which I'm going to go over in a minute. One of the great things about Ancestry is you can sign up to get alerts of when your area of interest has been indexed. So if you're interested in New York State or you're interested in Albany County, you can put your email address in and they will let you know when your area has been indexed, which is great because you may not just want to avoid the frustration altogether and wait until the name index has been generated. So here is an example of one of those ED maps that I'm talking about. And this one is for Guilderland. And Guilderland has a single ED number. So the whole town of Guilderland is under one single ED, and that is 1-88. That is the ED number. You can see the blue shaded area on the map shows the area that was enumerated in the 1-88 district. So all of the individuals that lived within that blue shaded area are going to be included on the 1-88 enumeration district. You can also see the other districts around the blue shaded area. So if you are looking for your ancestor, you don't find them in this particular enumeration district, you could try one of the surrounding ones. It makes it easy for you to find out which are the surrounding ones. So this is a little feature on Ancestry, which I find really useful. It's very interesting. Another thing that Ancestry is doing is the Barefoot genealogist, who is Krista Cowan, is providing weekly updates on the census progress via her YouTube channel. So if you go to her YouTube channel, and it's simply called the Barefoot genealogist, you can do the search at YouTube and you'll find her. She has hundreds of videos of all different topics, but she is offering this special series on the updates for the 1950 census. So she's going to be doing a video every week, letting everybody know what's going on with the indexing, how things are progressing. So we're going to have an awful lot of knowledge for using this database when it's finally done. So this is a great feature to be able to look into. So moving on to Family Search. Family Search is not currently offering really any kind of way to search, but what they are doing is they are asking for people's help to transcribe the records to make an index. You can go in there and you can be given a little small assignment of something to do. You can verify names, you can verify family information, you can review spelling. There's a few things that you can do on here to help out. I checked today and the statistics are 7 states are 25 to 40% completed. So that's pretty good. We are about 10 days after the release of the 1950 census. So that's the progress that Family Search is showing. And the 7 states are, Florida is one of them, and the rest are in the West. So none of the Northeast is included in the 7 states. But it's fascinating because they show you by map what exactly has been done. And here's the map, for example. So we've got Florida, we've got Arizona, we've got New Mexico, we've got Nevada, etc. So a lot of the states in the West are sort of getting done. So you can see that they're also working on Virginia and Louisiana, and then the gray areas are not available yet. So if you were to go in and do some transcription for Family Search, you'd be working on the states that are highlighted, either in white or in yellow. They have not made the others available yet. So if you're hoping not to work on New York, then hold off a little while and maybe you will be able to do that. So then to MyHeritage. MyHeritage is a subscription site. They are an international company, so they have some a little bit different types of databases available. It doesn't tend to be as well known as Ancestry and Family Search, but they are offering searches of the 1950 census free of charge. There's no name search, similar to the rest of the sites. There's no name search. They're using the Steve Morse tools to find people by location. So when you go in and you search by location, you're going to be using the same tools that are on the Steve Morse website. And they're making a claim that their index that they're producing is going to be ready by June 2022. So that's kind of a lofty goal. Be pretty interesting to see if they actually meet that goal. But that's what their claim is. So this is another alternative for searching. Maybe it's just a matter of which search capability you find easier to use. At this point, they should be fairly equal, but it will be interesting to see how their indexes progress and who ends up with the first complete index. So moving on to information. What can I expect to find on the 1950 census? Well, first of all, there's a lot of column headings. As you can see, this is only half of the page. And this is only half of the top because there are other column headings on the bottom. So probably the best thing that I can recommend to you is to check the Family Search Wiki for a complete explanation of all of the column headings and what they all mean. I think a lot of us, what we tend to do is we go into the census, we look at the information, and then we try to figure out what the little numbers and columns mean. And that's just normal. That's just human nature. And I expect it will be the same with the 1950 census. There are plenty of resources like the Family Search Wiki that can give you detailed information about what questions were being asked. Also, I would recommend finding and downloading a blank census form. Those can be found on any of the commercial sites. Those would have a blank census form. Many, many years ago, when I first started doing genealogy and all we had to look at census records was microfilm, I would use a blank census form and transcribe the information from the census that was on the microfilm onto a blank census form. And as a result of doing that exercise, I was able to get a really good handle on what those questions were because I had to examine them myself. So I would recommend doing that because that will help you to get to know the information that is on the census form. Otherwise, if we're just looking at digital images, maybe we're not quite absorbing all of that. So that's a really good thing to do. So the next few slides are just going to be lists of what the questions were. And it's not even a complete list because there's way too many. So these are just an idea of what the questions are and a more broad category for the questions. This is gone into in a lot more detail on the Family Search Wiki. So as far as locations, we're going to be looking at things like street address, which can be incredibly useful. Is it a farm? Is it a house on 3 or more acres? So kind of just information about the actual dwelling and where it's located. Next, we have questions that are related to the individual being counted. Of course, we're going to have their name. We're going to have the relationship to the head of the household. We're going to have their race. We're going to have their sex. How old was this person on his last birthday? It's going to give us marital status. What state or country was the person born in? And if this person was foreign born, is the person naturalized? So you see, we've got a bunch of questions that are familiar census questions, things that have been asked on other censuses prior to this one, and maybe even a little bit of a pullback, because just like the 1940 census, this is not asking for a place of birth for the person's parents. That got pulled back in 1940, and that is continued here with the pullback. They don't have that here. So then there are lots of questions that are employment related. And each person who was 14 years old or older had to answer these questions about employment. So there's interesting things like, what was this person doing most of last week? Were they working? Were they keeping house? Were they doing something else? So there's a lot of questions about the work that a person does, about the number of hours of work that a person is engaging in, and what the type of work is that the person is doing. There's a place on the bottom here that's saying class of worker the person is. Are they privately employed? Are they government employed? Do they have their own business? Or are they working without pay? So any of those would be a class of employment or a class of worker. So you can see the employment related questions are fairly extensive. So for 5% of the population, there were these supplemental questions asked. And again, this is only the tip of the iceberg as far as the supplemental questions asked. Now, I personally, being a genealogist, would have loved it if they'd asked these questions to everybody. But of course, we know that we are not going to, people in 1950 were not going to spend the time filling out long forms. So that's why these questions were only required of about 5%. Now, how did they choose the 5%? Well, what they did was, on the census form, there's a special line on each page, several lines actually, 2 or 3, I believe, that person, whoever was on that line, was going to be the person that answered supplemental questions. So if you had a small family, then you may very well not have had to answer sample questions at all. But if you had a large family or a large household, then someone in your household was probably going to have to answer the supplemental questions. And those included questions regarding where you lived in the previous year. Where were your parents born? What is the highest grade in school that the person completed? Is the person currently attending school? Again, questions concerning employment and wages earned. Did the person serve in the military? What is their marital status? How many times were they married? And if they were a female, how many children have they had? So these are supplemental questions, and again, only going to be responded to by 5% of the population. So here is the link to the full list of questions. It's on Family Search. If you go to Family Search and search in the wiki for 1950 census questions, it will bring this up and you'll be able to see it. And it goes into great detail about all of the questions asked. So we're going to do a little fun search, and I'm just going to do a little sample to show you the procedure for searching. Now, I chose my father-in-law because he's the only one of my parents or my in-laws that I've not been able to find. I found both my mother and my father and my husband's mother, but I have not been able to find my husband's father. So I chose to try to do him to see if I could find him using this method. And at the time he was, let's see, he was 21 years old. He was 21 years old. And he was living in New Bedford, Massachusetts. So he was a young man. He was not yet living on his own. He was allegedly living with his parents in New Bedford, Massachusetts. And that was a fairly decent sized city, not huge, maybe around the order of Albany or Troy, somewhere in that vein of population. So our first step is we want to find an address for him. So of course, we don't want to go through page by page of every single page of New Bedford in the 1950 census. because we're talking about multiple EDs here, probably, I don't know, 10 to 15 EDs at least, and each ED roughly about 25 pages. So I don't really want to sit here and go through every single page. I'd rather try to narrow it down by address. So the first step I'm going to do is try to get an address from a city directory. Now, you may already know the address of where your family lived in 1950. And if you did, wonderful, then you can skip this step and you can just go to the next step. But I didn't know that off the top of my head, so I needed to go look for city directories. So of course, when I go into Ancestry and I go looking for city directories, do you think there's a 1950 city directory for New Bedford? No, of course there isn't. So I have to go with the next best thing. I go with 1952, knowing that the information for the 1952 directory was submitted in 1951, which makes it a little closer to 1950. So we're going to look here and we see there's Stephen Doherty, student, residing at 83 Penniman Street. And just below him is his father, Thomas F. Jr., and his mother, Helen. And they're also residing at 83 Penniman Street. Okay, great. We got an address. We know that they're all there. This should be fairly straightforward. Hopefully we'll be able to find them. So now we're going to go to the Steve Morse ED tool finder. So what we're going to do is we are going to go to the utility for the 1950 census, which is plainly marked on his website. We're going to put in the state, which is Massachusetts. We're going to put in the county, which is Bristol. We're going to put in the city or town, which is New Bedford. And then we're going to put the house number, 83, and we're going to put the street name, Penniman. And then the drop-down menus of all of these, you're going to get all the states, you're going to get all the counties in Massachusetts, you're going to get all the cities and towns in Bristol County, and you're going to get all of the names of the streets in New Bedford on those drop-down menus. So you just pick out the name of the street that we found in the city directory. Then we are going to need to do the search. And when we do the search, it brings up a Google map of the address of 83 Penniman Street. From here, we are going to need to pick out street names on the same block as this address. So you can see from the red pointer that it's kind of all the way over on the left-hand side on Penniman Street, really near Reynolds Street. So Reynolds Street is going to be one of my streets that I choose. Again, there's going to be a drop-down menu, and you're going to choose from the drop-down menu. But also on the back side of the square of the block is Clark Street. So I put that on there. And on the other side, I'm going to put County Street. So now we've got a 4-street square. We've got Penniman, County, Clark, and Reynolds. So all of those are going to be together. So when we put all of those street names in, then it gives us the exact ED we're looking for, which is 2578. So that's what we're going to be looking at. So we can then take the ED number of 2578 and we could go to the NARA website, we could go to the Ancestry website, we could go to MyHeritage website, and we can put that ED number in. And that will bring up the entire ED for that area of New Bedford. And it's going to be about 26 pages, but we can go through those 26 pages and try to find the exact address and the name of my father-in-law. Conversely, on the Steve Morse website, he can bring you to exactly where this ED is. So you see on here, there are the select the viewer you want to use down at the bottom. You can use the NARA viewer, you can use the family search viewer, which again, not everything is available yet. And you could use the Ancestry viewer. He does not have a link to MyHeritage on here, but he does have these 3. So depending on what viewer you want to use, you can choose one of those viewers and it will take you right directly to it. So I chose the NARA viewer, and here I am going to the NARA website, and I have found the ED 2578 in the state of Massachusetts, in the county of Bristol, in the city of New Bedford. And we can see it has 26 pages. And underneath it, there is also a description of the ED that's telling us that it's bounded by Penniman Street, Weld Street, Reynolds Street. So there's a couple familiar names in there. So then if we click on population schedules, then we can look through all 26 pages that are in this ED. And you can enlarge them, you can bring them up so that you can read them. The handwriting I've seen is typical of handwriting of any census record. Some of it's readable, others aren't. Just depends. This particular one, I think, had several different kinds of handwriting in it, which I thought was a little strange. But irregardless, it was fairly easy to read, and the scans are very good quality, so they're not in poor condition. So finally, I found the address, 83. So on the side, on the left-hand side, you can see it says Penniman Street. And we can see the number 83. And we can also see the notation that says no one at home. Uh-oh, there was nobody there. So when the census taker came and knocked on the door, there was nobody there to answer the door and to say, you know, give the information. So what happened in that case was that the census taker had to go back at a later date and record the information out of sequence. So you can see that it says, see sheet number 73, line number, etc. So we have to look on a different sheet for the information about this household. So usually what happens is they will insert those supplemental sheets at the end of the ED. So when you get up to page 25 or 26, those are going to be the supplemental sheets. Those are going to be the sheets that record the people that were not home. So I fast forwarded a few pages to the last page to 73, and I found 83 Penniman Street. And living at 83 Penniman Street is somebody named Morris Silva. And I'm like, that's not the right name. So I'm wondering what's going on here. We knew that that was their address in 1952. Maybe they lived elsewhere in 1950. So again, I'm still thwarted. I still haven't found my father-in-law on the census, and I'm still going to have to keep looking. On the NARA website, you can search by name. Again, we're talking about the OCR technology. With my father-in-law's last name of Doherty, it's a lot of letters. It's hard for OCR to be able to capture handwriting with longer names. So going in, I can search and look for Doherty's in New Bedford, and there doesn't appear to be many of them, and he does not come up using a name search. So the name search is very hit or miss. I would encourage you to try it because in some cases it can work. But what you will probably get when you try it is you will probably come up with multiple images, and you will have to check each one of them out to see if the person you're looking for is in those images. All right, so that kind of does it. I can maybe take a little look at a search, and I was going to put those links in the chat. So I'm going to do that right now. I'm going to put the links in the chat first of all, before we do anything else. And if anybody's got any questions, you can let me know. Okay. And here's one link.
If you do have questions, just pop them into the chat.
Yep. And I'm going to go do the other link. Copy. Okay, so those are the two links. Now I'm going to attempt to do a share of the NARA website. Okay. All right, so here we are on the NARA website.
So Lisa, sorry,
yes.
Lisa, there's a question. What is NARA and is it free?
NARA stands for National Archives and Records Administration. And yes, it is free. The 1950 website is free for one and all to look at, as well as anything else that NARA hosts on their webpage. NARA is well known for the catalog of their holdings. They do partnerships with websites like Ancestry and with Family Search and with the military website Fold3. They partner with those websites to make more of the records that they have in their physical facilities available online. There's a lot of information on the NARA website, but it mostly has to do with their holdings and the things that they physically have in their repositories. So you are not going to find a lot of searchable content as far as names go on the NARA website, but you will find out information about the types of records that the National Archives does have at their physical facilities. All right, so if everybody can see my screen right now, I'm on the 1950 census website. And if we're going to search, we could go into search. And you can see here on the left-hand side, we have some utilities for searching. We have location, we have name, we have ED, if you know what the ED is. If you want to look at an Indian reservation schedule, we have that. So a lot of times what most people would do would be they would go in and look for information in a city or a state. So I'm going to look for my father. So I'm going to do New York, and I'm going to know that I know that he lived in Warren County. So I'm going to put that in here, and there he is. And now I'm going to put in his last name, which was Walsh, and I'm going to search. And then what it does is it brings us up different pictures where Walsh's may be on the page. So if you come down here to below the picture, you will see some of the names pulled out. These are the names that the artificial intelligence have pulled out from the pages. So you can see it's far from complete. But Walsh is one of the names on this page. And we can make it bigger, and we can search. We can see, okay, this is Charles and Cecile Walsh with their children, John and Linda, and that is not the right one. So let's continue down the page. Okay, we've got a James Walsh on this one. Click on population schedules, and it brings up the picture. And let's zoom in, see if this is the right one. Walsh James and his wife Martha and daughter Patricia. No, that is not the right one. So let's keep going down. And here we have Walsh here, and we're going to click on that one, and we're going to look at this picture. And this one, actually, there is a Walsh right here, Walsh Mabel. That was actually my father's mother, and she is a patient. She had tuberculosis, and she was a patient at the Westmount Sanatorium. So that is my father's mother. She's not living with her family. She was a patient. So if we keep going down, now we've got more Walshes. We've got Walsh Martin and Walsh Bernard, and I know that's not them, so I'm not going to click on them. Here we've got another James Walsh. Population schedule, click on, and we're going to zoom in and see if this is the right one. That's a James F. Walsh living by himself. That doesn't look like the right one either. So you see, you do have to do a little bit of scrolling through to see if you can find where your person is. It is helpful to know an ED. And we keep going. And here's a John M. This looks promising because that was my father's name. And here we are, Walsh John M. and John G., his son, and that's my father at the age of 12. So you can see what happens. We have to do a little bit of searching to be able to find the people that we're looking for. The artificial intelligence doesn't pick up all of the information with the names. Considering that it's been done completely by machine and there's been no human intervention as of yet, it's actually fairly impressive what has been able to be done with this, especially considering the previously released censuses had nothing like this at all. So the only option you had for searching in the previous release censuses was to know the place where your person lived. So now at least we have a little bit of a name index until we get the full name index provided to us. So has anybody got any questions? That was a good question about NARA. Again, there's a lot of information out there. Simply Googling 1950 census is going to bring up a host of information. And so if there's something that I've not addressed, and goodness knows there's an awful lot of stuff, then you can certainly find it by doing a Google search. I also know that there's been several of people who are fairly well-known genealogists who have done webinars about the 1950 census. I know Lisa Louise Cook has one out there. Any of those webinars I would recommend because they will give you their perspective. Margaret's asking, what do the volunteers do for family search? Well, they do all kinds of things. As far as the census goes, they are going through the census page by page and verifying information from the census. So verifying family structures, verifying spellings, verifying addresses. They have a very well coordinated volunteer effort. They're not just going to give you a census page and say, here, go transcribe it. They give you a fill in the blanks approach. So if you have a picture of the census on one screen, you're going to have, what is the name you see? What is the age you see? So you're going to be guided through it line by line. It has a lot of, it's very well done. So in other words, they know what kind of information they want. They know what they want people to transcribe, and they make sure there's no misunderstanding about it. So it's very well done. The census, of course, is not the only thing that volunteers transcribe at Family Search. They have a whole huge library in Salt Lake City that is being transcribed via volunteers. So if the census doesn't interest you, and maybe Swedish church records do interest you, then by all means, go to Family Search and get involved in the transcription effort because there's opportunities there for everybody. Any other questions? Well, if you don't have any other questions, I will type my email in here and you can send me a question later and I will be glad to answer it. Another quick announcement too is that starting in May at the Clifton Park Library, we will be back to drop in genealogy again. So you can just drop in anytime between the hours of 11 a.m. and 1 p.m. on the first Thursday of every month. And we'll be there in the local history room. There'll hopefully be a group of us there ready to help people with any questions that they have. And people have really missed the discussion group over the last couple of years. So this is a welcome addition, and I'm really glad that it's going to be back. So if you have not come to that yet, please do. It's a great group.
Yeah, it's great to have that back again.
Yes, absolutely.
Yes. Yep. And if anyone wasn't here when just before we got started, Lisa's doing another virtual program on May 9th for us on getting the most from your sources. So keep an eye on our calendar and register for that if you're interested. And this is being recorded, and I will send the link to everyone who signed up for this program as well.
Well, thank you so much, everybody, and hope to see you again next month, and either in person or virtually. So enjoy looking at the census and let me know how it goes.
Thanks, Lisa.
Yep. Bye-bye.